In this session, we're going to talk about preparing for the Leadership Circle debrief. So let's get started. These are the steps to consider before, during, and after receiving your results. Under before receiving your results, make sure that you schedule your 90-minute debrief meeting. This should be done between November 30th and November 4th. Second is, please email your latest performance review if you have not already done so. You can email it to harold@carterreynolds.com. What we're doing is we're getting all your information, your Leadership Circle profile information, your performance reviews, your pre-work, and we're using all that documentation to help prepare for your debrief session. So again, please send in your performance review if you have not already done so. Number 3 is attaches a video to watch on how to use others' feedback. That's on slide 5. And review the supporting presentation. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Then during your results, when you receive your results, 4 is your result and interpretation manual will be emailed to you 48 hours prior to your debrief session. It's password protective for security and for confidentiality, and the code is 630-400-7022 in order to open it up. Number 5, to better understand your feedback, review your results along with the interpretation manual. This tool will help you navigate through all the creative and all of the reactive dimensions, so you can get a clear understanding of what your feedback is essentially saying. And then number 6, answer the 5 reflection questions. That's on slide 17. And bring your written response to your debrief meeting, and that will help facilitate the overall process. Then after reviewing your results and receiving your debrief, number 7 is set up a meeting with your supervisor to discuss your feedback and your coaching plan. We'll discuss more about that in a debrief session. Then 8, send a letter to your evaluators to thank them for their feedback and discuss your action plans. Again, we'll talk more about that at debrief session. And then number 9, set up your feed forward team. This is a team. It could be 1 or 2, 3 people. Our recommendation is at least 3 people that you trust, that will give you honest and unfurnished feedback around some specific things that you want to improve that comes out of your debrief session. In this part of this review, it's what we call executive development, which is part 1. Throughout the engagement, you will receive a number of development sessions that either you can also share with your management team, but they will be a part of your development as it relates to the overall engagement. One of the things that we find when we work with high-performing cultures, high-performing organizations, and even high-performing teams, one of the key components of their success is the ability to receive feedback. And again, it's not just giving feedback, but it's the ability to effectively receive feedback. So we're going to take some time to go over that in preparation for your debrief session, as well as in preparation for you to review your Leadership Circle profile results. So let's get started. One of the worldwide experts in receiving and giving feedback is Sheila Heen. She's a best-selling author, a lecturer at the Harvard Business School, and she has written along with a co-author, 2 best-selling books. One, which you might have actually read, is Difficult Conversations, and based on the research and development and learning from this material, she also developed Thanks for the Feedback, which gets into the detail on how to effectively and strategically receive feedback. So let's take some time to listen to a discussion she had on how to effectively use other feedback. This video is approximately 20 minutes, just in terms of planning your time.
"15 years ago, my colleagues at the Harvard Negotiation Project and I wrote a book called Difficult Conversations. And I spent the last couple of decades traveling around the world helping people and organizations with some of their most challenging conversations. Now, the first thing that we do when we work with any group is that we say, well, what are your toughest conversations? What would you like some help with? And together we make a list that we can draw from throughout the day. Now, over the years, we started to notice a pattern, which is that feedback showed up on that list a lot. To put a finer point on it, feedback was on that list 100% of the time. It didn't matter what continent we were on. It didn't matter what industry we were in. It didn't even matter why they brought us in. People and organizations all over the world struggle with feedback. Now, for the first 10 years, we did what I think everybody does, which is that we taught givers how to give, more skillfully, more clearly, more often. How many of you have ever been to a session on how to give feedback? Did it help? Okay, please say yes, because I do some of that work. But your reaction echoes my own experience, which was, it helps. I mean, there's a lot you can learn, but it wasn't solving the problem. And then one day it occurred to us, you know what? In any exchange of feedback between giver and receiver, it's the receiver who's in charge. I mean, it's the receiver who decides what they're going to let in, what sense they're going to make of it, and whether and how they choose to change. I mean, maybe we've been going about this totally backwards. Maybe the key is learning how to take in the blizzard of feedback that we come in contact with every day. Because, by the way, I'm not just talking about performance reviews and other kinds of judgment and evaluation, grades, finding out how you measure up or stack up, you know, your marriage proposal, accepted, rejected. I mean, that's those kind of judgments are the most emotional kind of feedback. But I'm also just talking about everybody's suggestions for you, the little helpful parenting tips from your in-laws, right? And I'm also talking about the look in my third grader's eyes when she spots me in the audience, and those little nitpicky criticisms from my husband, which I think of less as feedback and more as just John being annoying, right? I mean, feedback is really our relationship with the world, and it's the world's relationship with us. I mean, what if we could actually see receiving feedback as a skill, and we could get better at learning from feedback, taking charge of it and driving our own learning, so we don't have to wait around for good givers to show up? Because I don't know about you, I have some good givers, wonderful mentors, but mostly my life is populated by everybody else, right? People who are terrible at doing it, don't have time for it, who are difficult themselves. What if we could draw learning out of even off-base, unfair, poorly delivered feedback? What would happen? Now, what's interesting is that we looked around and said, okay, what's out there about why it's so hard to receive feedback and what to do about it? And really, there wasn't much. But what there was some research suggesting that if we could get better at this, it would make a huge difference. There were big rewards. What the research shows is that people who go out and solicit negative feedback, and by that what they mean is they're not just fishing for compliments, they're looking for what they can improve. Those people report higher work satisfaction, they adapt more quickly in new roles, and they get higher performance reviews, which suggests that if you get better at handling everybody's feedback for you, it doesn't just change you. It changes how other people see you and experience you. Now let me ask you this. I want to invite you to think about a piece of coaching or suggestion or advice that you've received in your life that you've rejected. You didn't take it. I want to ask you, why didn't you take it? Just think about that for a moment. I mean, maybe it was just wrong. It was bad advice. Maybe you didn't trust the person giving it to you. Maybe you were actually unaware you cared about their opinion, which was unsolicited. Maybe it was confusing, or you weren't even sure how and whether you could change in that way. Maybe it was just too upsetting. Let me say right now, there are 100 people in this room. There are probably 100 reasons you didn't take the feedback. And you know what? Those are fantastic reasons to turn away feedback. Maybe. I want to say right now that getting better at receiving feedback does not obligate you to take the feedback. In fact, there are reasons why often we need boundaries, because other people's views of us can undermine our sense of self sometimes. But the problem actually is that we usually decide too soon. As human beings, we are incredibly good at something that we call wrong spotting. When feedback is incoming, I'm scanning it, because I need to figure out what's wrong with it. Who gave it to me, what they're suggesting, why they're probably giving it to me, where they gave it to me, really, at my grandmother's funeral, seriously? Because if I can find something wrong with it, well, I can set it aside, relax, and go on with my life. If it's right, I have to keep worrying about it. So we're incredibly incented to decide right away whether the feedback is right or wrong. Now, the fact that you have a triggered reaction isn't the end of the story. It's actually the beginning. Because here's the problem. You are always going to be able to find something wrong with your feedback, I promise. 90% of it might be wrong, but that last 10% might be just what you need to grow. As we looked at the hundreds and in fact thousands of reasons and reactions that we have to feedback, we found that actually they boil down really to 3. And so there are 3 kinds of triggered reactions that human beings have all over the world to the feedback that they get. The first is what we call truth triggers. This has everything to do with, well, is the feedback correct? Is it accurate? Is the advice good advice? Truth triggers are tricky to figure out what's true. Partly because of what we call the challenge to see. The challenge to see what in the world the giver's trying to tell you, and the challenge to see yourself accurately. Because we all have blind spots. Actually, I don't have blind spots, but I know that you guys all have blind spots, right? I mean, this is the nature of blind spots. The second kind of trigger is what we call relationship triggers. All feedback lives in the relationship between giver and receiver. And often we have a bigger reaction to who's giving it to us than what they're saying. Conquering this trigger has to do with the challenge of we, to separate the who from the what, and to deal with each on its own merits. The third kind of trigger is what we call identity triggers. This has everything to do with your emotional reaction to the feedback and the story you tell about what it says about who you are. What the research suggests is that individual sensitivity to feedback, by which I mean how far you swing emotionally in the wake of feedback and how long it takes you to recover, individuals can vary by up to 3,000%. Yeah. Let me say a little bit about what we've learned about this third identity trigger, and this picture captures it for me. Many of you probably know this is Michaela Maroney, an American gymnast. Coming into the London Olympics in 2012, she was widely regarded as the very best vaulter in the world, for good reason. She had won gold at the last 5 world competitions, and she had won by such a margin that there was no question among commentators. Obviously, Michaela's got the gold. The only question is who's going to take the silver and who's going to take the bronze. She fell on her second vault, ending a 33 vault hitting streak. Despite this, she scored so highly she still took the silver. And this is a picture of her on the medal stand receiving the silver. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the research on Olympic athletes and medalists, gold, silver, bronze. Who's happiest? Gold. Hello, they won a gold. Okay, it was not a trick question. But who's next happiest? Bronze. Why? What's the story the silver medalist tells about what just happened? Oh, I just lost gold. What's the story the bronze medalist tells? Yes! Woo, I medaled! Now this reminds me of 2 things. Number 1, the story you tell about the feedback you get has a huge impact on how you feel about it. And number 2, for high achievers, like Michaela. I think it's when we let ourselves down. It's the judgments and feedback we have for ourselves that can often be hardest to deal with. This picture went viral and became a meme with the headline, "Michaela is not impressed," suggesting she wasn't impressed with her fellow competitors. But I look at this and I suspect she's upset with herself. Now, psychologists like Marty Seligman estimate that our reactions to events in our lives are based about 50% on genetic, inherited wiring factors, just the way you're built emotionally. About 40% based on the story you tell about what happens, and only 10% based on the actual circumstances of your life. Now, who knows whether these are exactly the right numbers, but it does suggest that in that 50% and 40%, there is a lot of play to manage identity triggers more effectively. Let me say a little bit about the wiring piece. We took a look at 3 strands of research. The first is what I'm going to call baseline. In the literature, this is sometimes called set point. The idea here is that each of us lives at some set point or baseline degree of happiness or contentment in our life. So individual events will knock you off your baseline in one direction or another, but you're going to gravitate back toward that baseline. Now, this is based partly on looking at lottery winners in the UK. About a year after they won the lottery, they're about as happy or unhappy as they were before they won. Also, people with spinal cord injuries who become paraplegics. About a year and a half later, they're about as happy or unhappy as they were before. Now, let's imagine that the scale is 1 to 10. I mean, there are people who live their lives at 9, right? Do you know these people? Like, they're unbelievably excited, thrilled about everything in their life. It really does not matter if it's big, like, oh, we got the account, or small, like, that was an amazing cup of coffee. Okay? They're really kind of annoying. They show up a lot in the resilience research, right? Because nothing can get them down. Others of us live at 2 or 3. Always just discontent, a little restless, seeing the glass half empty. Now, why does this matter for feedback? It matters because if you live at a lower set point, it affects how you take in positive feedback. It means that the volume is turned down. It doesn't give you the same emotional bounce that it gives other people. So if you're someone who says, I just don't get why people care about appreciation or positive feedback, what's the big deal? It could be because they just live at a higher baseline than you do. The other 2 factors are swing, how far do you get knocked off your baseline by feedback in one direction or another, and then sustain or recovery, how long does it take you to come back? And this is what I was talking about when I was talking about differences being up to 3,000%, even inside your own family. Certainly inside your work team, where we're all giving and receiving feedback to each other, right? Now imagine you and I are on the same team. We get some negative feedback from the client. You're devastated. I think it's not that big a deal. This leads me to tell you, like, okay, like, you need to not take it so personally. Like, you're kind of overreacting to this. You just got to get a thicker skin if you're going to be in this business. Does this help you? No. Because now, actually, I'm just giving you feedback about how you take feedback, right? Which is really not helping. So understanding your profile can help you understand your own reaction. So by the way, there are challenges at either end of this spectrum. If you are very sensitive to feedback, one piece of feedback can suddenly become everything, and now can become forever. The feedback becomes supersized, and you can fall into what we call the Google bias. The Google bias is as if you are Googling everything that is wrong with me. And by the way, you get 1.2 million hits. All of your past mistakes, all of your failed relationships come rushing to the fore. There are sponsored ads here from your father and your ex, right? And it seems that nothing you have ever done has been right. Now we call this the bias because your search results are driven by your search terms. You're not Googling things I'm handling relatively well. If you were, you'd get 8 million hits, and you'd start to have a more balanced picture. In the depths of the Google bias, you cannot learn. You're just too overwhelmed. And you've got to not hide under the covers and hope the feedback goes away, but dismantle those distortions so that you can see the feedback at actual size and learn from it. Now, by the way, being insensitive to feedback, or perhaps I should say undersensitive, although if you're undersensitive, you don't really care what I call you, so it doesn't really matter, has its own challenges. I mean, one thing that happens is that you don't even realize people are trying to give you feedback, right? They say, you know, Bill does it this way. And you're like, good for Bill. The other thing that can happen is even when you get it, like you understand, okay, this is something you want me to work on, I think I agree with it, I'm totally gonna work on that. It may not stick in memory, because memory is highly correlated with emotion. And if you don't have an emotional reaction to the conversation, you have the best intentions in the world, but a week later, you've forgotten about it. 6 months later, they say, you know, we talked about this. You're like, oh, right, we did, didn't we? Sorry. The third thing that can happen if you are undersensitive is that you can be too quickly dismissive of feedback, and there's kind of an interesting pattern in how we do this. People give you feedback that you're aloof or overbearing or intimidating. You think, well, that's just not true. Because I know what's true is I'm just shy or outgoing or I have high standards. Both of these things, by the way, can be true. We're describing ourselves as we know ourselves from the inside based on our good intentions. But well-intentioned people have bad impacts on others all the time. And this is still a problem that we probably need to address if you're a leader or a spouse, particularly one who would rather not become an ex-spouse. So I'm going to give you a tool that you can use that will help you lower the stakes identity-wise. Please do not leave here and go out and say to your friends and colleagues, so, do you have any feedback for me? Sheila said I'm supposed to ask you. Okay, that is a terrible question. If you are asked that question, you're thinking, feedback about what? About your personality, your parenting, your pants? I don't know what I'm supposed to talk about. And like, how honest exactly am I supposed to be? Instead, ask a different question. Ask for one thing. Ask, what's one thing I'm doing, or maybe that I'm failing to do, that you think is getting in the way? What's one thing I could change about how I run our weekly meeting that you think would be an improvement? What's one thing I could change that would make a difference to you in our friendship? Notice I'm not asking, is there anything? You're assuming there's one thing. Because by the way, if you don't know what you need to be working on as a leader or a parent, you know who knows? Everybody else. Okay? They have a list. It's a secret list of all the things you do that drive them crazy, that make it harder for them to do their job or be your child. So when you ask them this, they're going to have an answer like that. They have been carrying it around with them. And by the way, a couple days later, they're going to come back with a second thing that they actually thought of, that they wish they would have said. So you might get one thing or two things. But you'll get something specific. And you get something that's worth considering and at least discussing. Look, none of this is easy. Because whatever your triggered reaction is to the feedback you get, there's a truth at the core of this that we can't get around. Which is that feedback really sits at the junction of two core human needs. On the one hand, we do want to learn and grow. I mean, this is why people take up new hobbies in retirement. It is the only thing that really explains the relationship between human beings and the game of golf, right? Because that occasional good round fools us into thinking that we're getting better. So feedback should be exhilarating, but the problem is we bump into this second thing, which is the need to be accepted and respected and loved the way we are now. And the very fact of feedback suggests that how we are now is maybe not A-okay. That the people around you, closest to you, want a few more upgrades to who you are. And yet, while this helps me explain my conflicted relationship with feedback, that sometimes it's exhilarating. It's a great source of joy. It's also some of the most painful things in our lives. And yet, how many of you would say that some of the most important things you've learned in life have come from some of your most painful experiences? So what's up with that? Why can't we have a pain-free human learning system? There's part of me that wishes I could offer you that, but in the meantime, this work for me is about learning to understand and manage the pain, to enrich our relationships, and to get to the learning faster. Thank you.
Now this video, some of our clients have found it to be extremely powerful. and some have shared it with their team with tremendous results in terms of improving communication, improving trust. This whole ability to receive feedback effectively is critical. One of the key points around it is feedback is our relationship with the world. And feedback does not just change who we are, but it changes the relationships that we have with others. The next few slides, I'm just going to cover some of the key points, but I strongly recommend after reviewing your feedback, and if there's a sense of frustration, a sense of concern, I strongly recommend going back and just listening to this video and some of the key comments just one more time before attending the debrief. So here are some of the key elements from what she talked about. Some of the summary key points is to get the most out of feedback, you should open up your identity and switch to a growth mindset. This is one of the reasons why we had each of the participants do a leadership brand pre-work exercise to essentially look at your life, look at your leadership, look at your skills, and look at your values, with the whole idea that the purpose of this feedback is to grow. And this leadership brand pre-work helps establish that foundation going forward. Number 2 is the story you tell yourself about the feedback will affect how you take it and act on it. That you control your story through your emotions and your thoughts. And number 3, always look at feedback as an intersection of two realities. What you see is not the same as what others see. The 3 types of feedback are appreciation, which you build relationships, appreciate and encourage; coaching, to help you grow, change and improve, and uncover any blind spots you might have; and then 3, evaluation feedback. It's around comparison against others or against certain standards to align expectations and to inform certain decisions. It's important to understand that the feedback that we're going to be discussing with the Leadership Circle is about coaching and about appreciation. It's not about evaluation. In the video, she discusses the 3 defensive feedback triggers. One is the truth trigger. Truth trigger means understanding whether the feedback is true or not. And it can be more complex than we think. And it's important to understand how to skillfully analyze that feedback. The challenge is how we see ourselves versus how others see us, and we don't recognize the blind spots that we have. And that's where the challenge comes in terms of really determining what is the truth about the feedback. We'll talk more about that in the debrief. Then there's identity triggers. Identity is the story we tell ourselves about who we are. If the feedback challenges the idea that we have about ourselves, it's possible that it will be highly destabilizing for us, and we'll either lash out or reject the feedback just outright. A huge determinant of how we take feedback at an identity level is whether we have a fixed, which is we have a certain view of ourselves that we're not open and not willing to change, or where we have a growth mindset, which we'll talk more about later. And then the relationship triggers. Do we respect or like the person giving us the feedback? Did the feedback giver treat us well in the process of giving the feedback? And also, do we trust or respect them? Are they credible? How our stories affect feedback. A major component of how we react and act on our feedback is the story we tell ourselves about it. Thoughts plus feelings equal that story. That means what we think about the feedback and how we feel when we receive it will determine what we tell ourselves about the feedback. And that will ultimately influence how we react and how we act upon that feedback. To control how we feel and act on the feedback, we must first control our feelings and thoughts. And feelings, for example, if we are tense or we're upset, or we're concerned or feel threatened, it pushes the fight or flight response. And this response, again, comes at us as a threat. So it's important to calm ourselves and to think about the realities of what the feedback is for. And then there's thoughts, the thoughts that we have, that we tell ourselves about the feedback. And we have an easier time in controlling those thoughts when we've developed a mindset of how we want to go into the feedback session. Roadblocks to good feedback could be one, there's different data. We might be looking at different data from the person that might be giving us a feedback. The data could actually be different, or the interpretation of that data, number two, may be the same, but we approach reviewing that data from our own biases and preferences. Or three, there could be psychological biases. We'll assign good intentions to ourselves, but not always to the other person. And so that could influence the feedback. And then three, blind spots that we discussed. We don't see ourselves, we don't see what we don't see about ourselves that others see in terms of body language, in terms of knowledge gaps, and those things get in the way of feedback. And so these are stated here just to be conscious of these elements as we give and receive feedback. There's also a need to recognize the need from a systems view. Often feedback is given in a way that communicates you are this way and it's a problem. But sometimes the problem is not one person, but it's the intersection between two people. For example, a person not returning emails immediately might not be a problem if that coworker didn't need a quick response to meet, let's say, a commitment to get a report done, or to fill out whatever information that needs to take place, or respond to his or her superior on a problem or an issue. So it's the intersection between the email and the report timing or communication timing commitment, whatever the commitment might be, that creates the issue. Oftentimes we see that that's the feedback issue between peers that work in different departments or different functions that could get in the way of effective feedback and effective communication. And it's the system itself and not necessarily the individuals that truly have the feedback issue. So we'll talk more about that if that becomes an issue in your feedback as it relates to peers or in some other dimension. So here are the levels you should look at is you and the intersection between where there's personal differences, or if there's role classes, department clashes, functional classes, or the environment itself, where you're responding to different processes, laws, measurements, or other players in different roles. So finally, 6 strategies to get the most out of feedback. One is receiving feedback well does not always mean accepting the feedback. It means engaging in the conversation skillfully, making good choices on how to use the feedback appropriately. 2, manage your emotional triggers so that you don't get defensive and become reactive. 3, switching to and maintaining a growth mindset throughout the feedback process. 4, see feedback as a gift that you have total control over how to use it. 5, adopt a more open, resilient, and value-driven identity. Otherwise, the tendency is to simply reject the feedback, defend ourselves, or defend who we think we are. And then finally, accept that you have complex and mixed intentions. Be accepting of the fact that everyone has blind spots, and so do you. So that kind of concludes some of the key notes as it relates to receiving feedback. What follows now are some things you should do after Review after you receive your results. After you receive your results. For those of you that need a refresher on the overall model itself, and again, if you just want to use the interpretation manual, well, I do recommend that you use that in terms of going along with viewing your actual results. However, if you want to get an overall review of the model itself, here's a 4-minute video that again describes the overall model. So I'll start that now.
Hi, I'm Betsy Leatherman, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about the Leadership Circle Profile Model. If you were to think of this circle as the globe and imagine that this was the equator line, anything north of that line, that's what we call the creative competencies. Creative competencies are leadership behaviors that are long-term focused in nature, and they are highly correlated with leadership effectiveness and business performance. They are leadership behaviors that tend to be engaging, inspiring, and unleashing of energy in the system. They truly scale the capacity and capability of the organization. Anything south of that line, that's what we call the reactive tendencies. And these are also leadership behaviors that get results. They tend to do that in a short time frame, and they often cost the system around the leader or the leader quite a bit of energy. So the top is creative and the bottom is reactive. The left-hand side are all relationship in nature, and the right-hand side are all task. So if you were to think of it in 4 quadrants, it would be creative relationship, reactive relationship, and creative task and reactive task. So the way this works, there is an inner circle and an outer circle of leadership competencies. The inner circle creative competencies are relating, self-awareness, authenticity, systems awareness, and achieving. And the inner circle reactive dimensions are complying, protecting, and controlling. So if you were to take any of these inner circle dimensions and ask yourself, what is this really made up of? All you have to do is go to the outer dimension to understand that. So for relating, as an example, you go to the outer dimensions and you see that caring connection, fosters team play, collaborator, mentoring and developing, and interpersonal intelligence are the outer dimension categories for relating. For self-awareness, it's selfless leader, balance, composure, and personal learner. For authenticity, it's integrity and courageous authenticity. And for systems awareness, it's community concern, sustainable productivity, and systems thinker. And finally, in achieving, strategic focus, purposeful and visionary, achieves results, and decisiveness. Those are all of the inner and outer competencies on the creative side of the model. In reactive, complying is made up of conservative, pleasing, belonging, and passive. Protecting is made up of distance, critical, and arrogance. And finally, controlling is made up of autocratic, ambition, driven, and perfect. When you receive your results, you'll have access to your raw scores, your percentile scores, and your self-scores. Your percentile scores will essentially tell you how you stack up against the spectrum of leaders that have taken the profile, and your self-score is how you rate yourself. Your self-score will be shown using a gray bar, and your percentile scores will be shown using green shading. You will be compared to a norm group that accurately reflects the state of global leadership. So for example, if the green shading were to go to the 70th mark on mentoring and developing, that means 70% of the leaders score below you in that particular category. So that's a little bit about the Leadership Circle Profile Model. In your debrief session, your coach will tell you much more. You'll get a better understanding of how the model works as both an assessment tool and a model of leadership behavior. Be sure to watch the next video, What to Expect in Your Debrief, so you can be adequately prepared for that conversation.
Now the next short video, it's about 1.5 minutes. It discusses key interpretation factors when you're reviewing the profile itself, particularly when you're reviewing the leadership circle.
I want to give you the key to interpreting the Leadership Circle Profile Report. High scores in the bottom half will actually pull down related scores in the top half. For example, when you have a high reactive score like controlling in the bottom half of the inner circle, simply follow across the circle to where it points to the top half of the circle. This identifies the creative competencies most likely to be limited by the high control leadership. In this example, it points to low scores in the competencies labeled as relating and self-awareness. It's highly predictable that high control reduces competencies in areas such as teamwork, trust, and collaboration. And you might ask the question, is the top half of the circle good and the bottom half bad? The answer is there's nothing negative or bad in the reactive dimensions. In fact, each dimension has a strength or gift associated with it. However, when that gift is used reactively, it becomes overused, as indicated by high scores. The bottom line is this: strengths overused can severely handicap your leadership effectiveness.
So after you've had a chance to go through your information, look at your comments, look at your scores, your raw scores, as well as the overall summary scores, and again, really dig into the comments from your boss, direct reports, peers, etc. Then take the time to really answer these 5 reflective questions. One is, what feedback surprised you the most from your boss, peers, direct reports? 2, what feedback is consistent with your expectations? Again, from your boss, direct reports, and peers. Number 3, what feedback is consistent with your values and the leadership brand intentions as expressed in your leadership brand pre-work that you did? Number 4, what feedback is not consistent with the values and leadership intentions as expressed again in your leadership brand pre-work? And finally, after careful reflection on your leadership circle profile feedback, what are the 3 most important things you would like to improve in your leadership style, leadership behaviors, or leadership capability? So if you can please complete these questions and bring them with your feedback to the debrief meeting. So thank you, and we look forward to speaking with you at your debrief session. Have any questions, please don't hesitate to give Carter or myself a call. Take care.